On September the 9th, 2025, Israeli jets screamed over the Persian Gulf to do something unprecedented. They bombed downtown Doha, the capital city of a US ally that hosts America's largest military base in the Middle East. This wasn't a strike on some remote compound or military installation in the desert. The target was Hamas leadership sitting comfortably in the offices Qatar had provided them for over a decade. 6 people died in the attack, including a Qatari security guard who had the misfortune of being on duty at the wrong time in the wrong place. Within hours, the UN Security Council condemned the attack. The United States, a longtime ally of the tiny Gulf monarchy, called the strikes counterproductive. The European Union worried about regional escalation. The world rallied to defend Qatar's sovereignty, even though everyone knew who was in those offices. That's Qatar's achievement. They've made hosting terrorists so essential to international diplomacy that bombing those terrorists becomes a crime. The permanent house guests. So understanding how Qatar became terrorism's 5-star hotel requires looking at who exactly they're hosting and why nobody seems able to make them stop. Qatar's relationship with controversial groups, not exactly a secret. They've practically turned dealing with such organizations into an enterprise. It's conducted in glass office towers in downtown Doha, in luxury compounds with security provided by the state, in 5-star hotels where peace negotiations drag on for years. Hamas provides the clearest example of how Qatar operates. Their relationship reflected their broader strategy of maintaining ties with everyone while committing to no one. They hosted an Israeli trade office through 2009, one of the few Gulf states to do so, then closed it during the Gaza war that same year, pivoting towards Hamas just as the other Arab states were moving away. This could be seen as fence-sitting, but more realistically should be seen as strategic positioning. Qatar saw opportunity where others saw liability. Former Emir Hamad bin Khalifa Al Thani was famously close with Muslim Brotherhood figures across the region, and Hamas, as the Palestinian branch of the Brotherhood, fit perfectly into Qatar's vision of political Islam as the future of Arab governance. For over a decade, Hamas's political leadership had operated from Damascus, with Syria providing sanctuary to key figures like Khaled Mashal since the 90s. This relationship became strained after the Syrian civil war erupted in 2011 and fell apart completely after Assad made clear that Hamas was to support his regime's crackdown on the opposition, an impossible ask for the Sunni Islamist movement. Rather than scattering to hiding places across the Middle East, though, they had the fortune of relocating to Qatar at Doha's invitation. Mashal and Ismail Haniyeh accepted the invite eagerly, setting up operations that weren't rough underground safe houses, but elaborate homes and offices with the infrastructure to run a government in exile that controls Gaza. The arrangement was conducted entirely in the open, with Hamas leaders giving press conferences from their Doha offices and meeting foreign diplomats in 5-star hotels. The numbers tell the story of Qatar's commitment. Since Hamas arrived in Doha, Qatar has provided an estimated $1.8 billion in support to Gaza. Officially, this is humanitarian aid, salaries for civil servants, fuel for hospitals, and reconstruction after the conflict. But critics point out that there's little meaningful distinction between supporting Gaza's government and supporting Hamas itself, as they've integrated so thoroughly. The money might go to hospitals, but that also freed up Hamas's own resources for tunnels and rockets. Now, the mechanics of this varied over the years, sometimes consisting of literal suitcases of cash. Back in 2018, Qatari envoys were caught on camera carrying millions in physical currency into Gaza. By 2021, the annual support had reached $360 million. Doha's envoy was blunt, quote, "You have to support them, they control the country." Now, for years, this arrangement allowed Hamas to operate with relative impunity while abroad, planning operations while Qatar's financial support kept Gaza functioning. Like house guests who've overstayed their welcome but know where you keep the spare key, Hamas had made themselves impossible to evict. The October 2023 attacks that killed 1,200 Israelis were coordinated by leadership operating partly from those very offices in Doha, though the extent of planning that occurred there versus in Gaza remains disputed. And that's where it gets truly surreal. After the attacks, when the world needed someone to negotiate hostage releases, they turned to the country that was hosting the very leaders who orchestrated the massacre. Qatar's hosting of Hamas leadership made them indispensable to any diplomatic solution after October 7th, working alongside Egypt as the primary channels for negotiation, though only Qatar could offer direct access to the decision-makers in Doha. Hamas wasn't Qatar's most controversial tenant, not even close. If hosting the group that attacks Israel seemed audacious even for regional standards where sympathies to the Palestinian resistance run deep, they also host one of the United States' longest-running military adversaries at Washington's own request. The arrangement began in 2013 when the Obama administration made a request that would have seemed insane a decade earlier. Would Qatar host an official Taliban political office? Keep in mind that this was during the heights of the war in Afghanistan, asking an official US ally to give the Taliban, the same group that harbored al-Qaeda before 9/11, their first official representation since the 2001 invasion. Qatar's acceptance led to an immediate diplomatic incident when the Taliban raised their flag in Doha, infuriating then Afghan President Hamid Karzai, who briefly withdrew from negotiations entirely in protest. Yet the office stayed open, and for 7 years American diplomats found themselves meeting Taliban representatives in Doha's hotels and compounds in various efforts to wind down or end America's longest war. It was a bipartisan effort too. Despite being initially set up under the Obama administration, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's September 2020 photograph with Taliban negotiator Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar in Doha gave the insurgents a diplomatic victory they'd craved for 2 decades. Everything about the US withdrawal from Afghanistan ran through Doha. The original February 2020 agreement was signed there, and Mullah Baradar went straight from his Qatari guest house to the presidential palace itself when Kabul fell in 2021. Rather than distancing itself from the victorious insurgent group, Qatar leaned into this role as the new government in Afghanistan's gateway to the world, becoming a transit point for evacuees and now hosting the relocated US diplomatic mission. The fact that no member of the international community recognized the Taliban's government until this year only compounded the necessity for such a role. The world is forced to conduct all diplomatic business through Doha whenever Afghanistan needs attention. So Qatar had the guest list from hell. But what really made them indispensable wasn't just who they hosted, it was their willingness to foot the bill. The indispensable mediator. The maddening genius of Qatar's strategy reveals itself through a fundamental paradox. While some Western politicians and commentators criticize them for sheltering Hamas, their governments simultaneously depend on Qatar to negotiate with the group. The Hamas political bureau that operates from Qatari-provided officers doubles as both a planning center for Palestinian resistance and the primary address for ceasefire negotiations. It's diplomatic flexibility that, shall we say, other regional powers either can't or won't match. But whatever you call it, it has yielded real results. This capability extends well beyond just Gaza. In 2008, Lebanon was teetering on the edge of a civil war. Hezbollah had shut down Beirut's airport in a stunning act of insurgency that demonstrated just how fragile the country's government's grasp on power really was. The Saudis wouldn't negotiate with Hezbollah. The group's deep Shia ties and connections made them deeply suspicious of one another, a sentiment shared throughout many of the Sunni-dominated Gulf monarchies. But Qatar? They invited everyone to Doha, Hezbollah included, and hammered out the Doha agreement that pulled Lebanon back from the brink. Where ideology prevented others from even sitting at the table, Qatar's transactional approach got results. This approach became absolutely crucial to international geopolitics in the wake of the October 7, 2023 attack. The Hamas leadership that had coordinated the killing of 1,200 Israelis operated at least part from those same Doha officers, which had far greater access to international embassy and negotiations than they did in Gaza City. With the international community scrambling to negotiate hostage releases, such diplomatic proximity proved invaluable. American intelligence officials became fixtures in Doha's hotels, with Mossad, State Department, and CIA officials making repeated trips to coordinate negotiations. American officials found themselves publicly thanking Qatar for its vital role in securing captives' freedom. The relationship between Qatar and Hamas hasn't been without friction. By early 2024, Qatar reportedly grew frustrated with Hamas's intransience on hostage releases, with reports emerging that they threatened to expel the leadership if Hamas didn't show flexibility, though seasoned observers noted both sides likely understood these threats as negotiating leverage rather than genuine ultimatums. The dance has continued through 2025. Hamas stayed, negotiations proceeded, and even after Israel's unprecedented September airstrikes that killed 6 people, including a Qatari security guard, the Egyptian-Qatari mediation channel remained the primary diplomatic track. The strikes revealed the paradox. Israel was willing to bomb Qatar's capital to target Hamas leaders, yet still needed Qatar's officers to negotiate with those very same leaders. The Taliban arrangement demonstrated similar diplomatic utility. For 7 years before America's withdrawal from Afghanistan, US diplomats met Taliban representatives in Doha's conference rooms, searching for a negotiated end to America's longest war. The February 2020 agreement that set the withdrawal in motion was signed in Doha, and when Kabul fell in August 2021, Qatar played a vital role in coordinating the evacuation of 124,000 people, with nearly half passing through Doha's airports. The US then relocated its Afghan diplomatic mission to Qatar, making Doha the gateway for any dealings with Taliban-controlled Afghanistan, a role that no other regional power could or would play. From Qatar's perspective, they've created a unique diplomatic niche, serving as the indispensable intermediary for conflicts involving non-state actors that other nations won't recognize. Critics argue this amounts to legitimizing and protecting terrorists, while supporters counter that someone needs to maintain these channels, that purely military solutions rarely work, and negotiated settlements require talking to all parties, however unsavory. The international community's continued reliance on Qatari mediation, even while criticizing their methods, suggests that pragmatism often trumps principle in the messy reality of conflict resolution. Checkbook diplomacy. So, if hosting controversial groups made Qatar useful, its willingness to pay for their operations made it indispensable. The Muslim Brotherhood represented Qatar's biggest financial bet on regional transformation. Unlike housing Hamas or the Taliban in Doha offices, this was about backing an entire transnational movement that Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE considered an existential threat to their monarchies. Yusuf al-Qardari, the Brotherhood's spiritual leader, has been broadcasting his weekly sermons from Qatar for decades through Al Jazeera. The network, which revolutionized Arab media when it launched in 1996 with controversial debates, had long given Islamists prominent platforms alongside its more independent journalism. During the Arab Spring, this existing tendency shifted into overdrive. The network began to function increasingly as the movement's mouthpiece. Speaking of the Arab Spring, when it emerged in 2011, Qatar saw its chance. As Brotherhood-affiliated parties won elections in Egypt and Tunisia and gained influence in Libya and Syria, Qatar opened its checkbook. Their immediate pledge of $8 billion when Mohamed Morsi and the Brotherhood took power in Egypt represented a massive bet on Islamist governance that their neighbors watched with horror. After General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi overthrew Morsi a year later, the contrast could not have been starker. Saudi Arabia and the UAE celebrated while Qatar condemned the coup and continued sheltering Brotherhood leaders, providing not just asylum, but active financial and political support. The growing tension with their Gulf neighbors over this support would eventually explode into the most serious regional crisis in decades. But Qatar, on the whole, remained committed to the Brotherhood. The pattern of financial support extended far beyond the Brotherhood. The US Treasury's 2014 assessment wasn't diplomatic. Qatar operated a, quote, permissive terrorist financing environment. This wasn't about state policy, though that was questionable enough, but about a system where private donors could openly fundraise for jihadists while authorities just looked the other way. The Syrian civil war became the proving ground for this permissive approach. What started as support for legitimate opposition groups morphed into something darker, with wealthy Qataris holding public fundraising events for Syrian rebels, including groups affiliated with al-Qaeda's Nusra Front. They weren't hiding. They used social media, operated through Qatar's banking system, and treated funding jihadists as a charitable cause worthy of public celebration. One prominent fundraiser, Abdul Rahman al-Nuaimi, was designated by the US Treasury for financially supporting al-Qaeda, yet continued operating from Qatar for years. When pressed about why such individuals could operate so openly, Qatari officials would claim they couldn't control private citizens, even as they efficiently shut down any domestic dissent. The mechanisms for moving money varied, but followed recognizable patterns that authorities seemed curiously unable to stop. Hawala networks, those informal money transfer systems that leave no paper trail, operated alongside charitable organizations that expertly mixed legitimate humanitarian work with militant funding, while wealthy individuals would write checks at fundraising dinners where speakers openly praised jihadist groups. The Qatari government would occasionally make token arrests or announce new regulations that looked good on paper, but enforcement did remain conspicuously absent. The ransom economy reveals Qatar's approach even more starkly. In 2014, when 45 UN peacekeepers were kidnapped by Nusra Front in Syrian-controlled areas of the Golan Heights, their solution was straightforward: pay $25 million to al-Qaeda's Syrian affiliate. While Doha has publicly rejected this assertion, numerous outlets have documented the payment. Video footage actually exists of the purported Qatari funds being transferred to the militants. The peacekeepers were released, all 45 of them, and Qatar received international gratitude for securing their freedom. Critics pointed out that Doha had just handed al-Qaeda significant operating funds and created dangerous incentives for more kidnappings. Qatar's defenders argued that other nations' refusal to negotiate had left the hostages languishing for weeks with no solution in sight. Whether those 45 lives justified enriching al-Qaeda by $25 million, that depends on who you ask. What's undeniable is that Qatar's approach, however controversial, delivered results where others' principles had delivered only deadlock. The peacekeepers were only the beginning of what became a relatively established framework. Western journalists, aid workers, and religious pilgrims held by Syrian jihadist factions found themselves repeatedly freed through Qatari brokered deals that reportedly involved large cash payments. The monarchy developed a reputation as the go-to mediator for hostage situations, but also as the country most willing to pay. As the years dragged on, Qatar's reputation began to entangle it in some rather unfortunate situations. An incident in 2017 revealed just how tangled Qatar's payments had become. 26 Qatari royals, including members of the ruling family, had gone falcon hunting in southern Iraq, something of a tradition among Gulf elite, and there they were kidnapped by Kataib Hezbollah, an Iranian-backed Shia militia. The hostage crisis dragged on for 16 months, and when it finally ended, the details that emerged were almost too absurd to believe. The reported ransom reached up to $1 billion. But here's where it gets truly bizarre. Qatar didn't just pay the kidnappers. To get their royals back, they had to pay both the Iraqi Shia militias who held them and Syrian Sunni rebel groups who had nothing to do with the kidnapping. The reason was pure extortionate scale. Iran and its proxies had linked the royal hostage release to a completely separate deal in Syria, the evacuation of 4 besieged towns. 2 Shia towns needed safe passage, as did 2 Sunni towns. The Syrian rebels controlling the Sunni areas demanded payment to allow the evacuations, while the Iranian-backed groups holding the Qatari royals demanded payment to release them. Everyone saw Qatar's desperation as an opportunity to cash in, and they had no choice but to pay everyone. Iranian proxies, Syrian rebels, even groups actively killing each other just to get their people back. The cash component was stunningly literal. Qatar reportedly flew in suitcases of money, with Iraqi authorities briefly seizing around $500 million at Baghdad airport, underscoring just how physical these transactions were. It was the ultimate culmination of taking Qatar's philosophy to its logical conclusion. When in doubt, pay. It didn't matter that these groups were sworn enemies fighting a sectarian war. For the right price, Qatar would fund all sides simultaneously. This wasn't ideological alignment. Qatar is Sunni-led and doesn't subscribe to Iran's revolutionary Shiism. But they'd pay Shia militias just as readily as Sunni jihadists if it served their purposes. After the 2006 Israel-Hezbollah war, Qatari reconstruction money flowed into southern Lebanon, rebuilding villages and Hezbollah strongholds where few other Gulf states would venture. Those same neighbors watched this with horror. Saudi Arabia and the UAE saw Hezbollah as nothing more than an Iranian terror proxy, yet here was Qatar treating them as legitimate political actors. They'd also maintained contacts with Yemen's Houthi rebel groups, getting them expelled from the Saudi-led coalition for allegedly cozying up to groups Riyadh considered mortal enemies. After October 2023, Qatar kept the money flowing to Gaza even as international scrutiny intensified. Critics argued that with Hamas controlling Gaza, any support for the enclave's infrastructure effectively strengthened the group's governance when it wasn't directly siphoned off. Qatar, for its part, maintained its long-standing position. Humanitarian aid shouldn't be conditional on political approval of who's in charge. The people of Gaza needed water and electricity, regardless of who governs them. By 2017, under US pressure, Qatar signed a Memorandum of Understanding on terror financing and claimed to strengthen its controls. The Treasury praised expanded cooperation. State Department reports noted continuing counter-terrorism collaboration. But did anything really change? The fundamental willingness to pay remained, only the mechanisms became slightly more sophisticated. They weren't going to stop doing what made them indispensable. How to get away with funding terrorists. Alright, so all of this just leaves us wondering, how does Qatar manage to pull all this off? Where does it get all of this money? And furthermore, even if it has the means to afford all these operations, how does it get away with them? The Taliban and the al-Nusra Front aren't exactly unknown to the international community. They are extensively sanctioned and internationally isolated. The money half of that has a very simple answer: natural gas, and a shitload of it. While the region is infamous for its vast oil reserves, natural gas is less common. Qatar alone, despite its tiny size, holds about 1/3 of the entire region's supply. This single resource generates tens of billions annually, making Qatar the world's second largest exporter of liquefied natural gas, behind only the United States. Unlike oil, which fluctuates wildly and faces increasing competition from renewables, LNG demand is growing as countries both transition away from coal, which burns far dirtier, and away from Russia's supply. Qatar has essentially been guaranteed income for decades to come. That money gets channeled through their sovereign wealth fund, the Qatar Investment Authority, which sits on over $450 billion in assets. They own chunks of Barclays, Volkswagen, Harrods, the Empire State Building, and seemingly half of London's premium real estate, a story complicated enough for another day. Let us know in the comments if you want to see that. All this investment gives them real leverage. Threatening Qatar means threatening your own financial system. But money alone doesn't explain how they get away with hosting groups that are considered international pariahs just about everywhere else on the planet. The real answer lies in a structure they've carefully been building over decades. First, there's the American Shield. Al Udeid base alone hosts 10,000 US troops and serves as the forward headquarters of US Central Command. The majority of American military operations in the Middle East run through here, both in terms of strategic planning as well as physical equipment. Then there's the diplomatic cover Qatar has cultivated, which does have at least some credibility going for it. They don't present themselves as sponsors or promoters of terrorism. They're mediators, humanitarian facilitators, and even regional stabilizers. When they host Hamas, it is for peace negotiations. When they shelter the Taliban, well, that was quite literally at America's own request. Every controversial relationship gets wrapped in diplomatic language that makes it politically difficult to challenge. All this isn't to say that they haven't faced real pushback, though. Back in 2017, it faced the test of the century. While most Gulf states had long coordinated their foreign policies, Qatar had spent decades charting its own course, maintaining relationships with everyone from Iran to Israel, from Islamists to secularists. From Saudi and Emirati perspectives, these went beyond policy disagreements. The Muslim Brotherhood represented an existential threat to their monarchies by espousing a revolutionary ideology that could topple their thrones, and they had had enough of Doha support for it. By June that year, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, and Egypt decided that they needed to take action, and not just in the form of another diplomatic spat between the princes. They collectively announced a total blockade of Qatar. Land borders were sealed, airports closed, ships banned from ports. Riyadh even made the historically unprecedented and admittedly slightly hilarious move of threatening to turn the country into an island by digging a massive channel across their land border from sea to sea. They issued a series of 13 demands that essentially amounted to Qatar surrendering its sovereignty, including closing Al Jazeera and severing all ties and support to groups they categorized as terrorists, namely the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas. It was a proposal that was dead on arrival. Qatar's defiance was remarkable. Despite being surrounded by these larger countries, they held their ground. Years of doing business with isolated states had its advantages, as it turned out, by making friends who weren't afraid of further reprisals. Within days of the blockade being implemented, Iranian cargo planes were landing in Doha with food, and Turkey fast-tracked a military deployment onto Qatari soil to deter any Saudi military adventures. Western powers, specifically Washington, were not exactly thrilled with the development. The Pentagon made crystal clear that its operations at Al Udeid would continue regardless, a Gulf blockade be damned. Europe, for its part, was worried about the flow of natural gas that it heavily relies on to this day to heat its homes and run much of its industry. After 3 years, Saudi Arabia abruptly ended the embargo, and crucially, Qatar made no public concessions whatsoever. The very groups and institutions that sparked the crisis remained exactly where they were. Hamas leaders continued operating from their Doha offices. Taliban representatives maintained their diplomatic compound, and Al Jazeera broadcasts went on without interruption. The episode that was supposed to force Qatar into submission had instead proven their model was essentially untouchable. The September 2025 Israeli strike on downtown Doha should have been a watershed moment. For the first time in modern history, a nation had directly attacked Qatar for hosting terrorist leadership. Despite all the security agreements with Washington, the message from those F-35 seemed unambiguous. Hosting terrorists makes you a legitimate target. Diplomatic agreements be damned. Yet what happened after those strikes reveals just how deep the dependency goes. The Egyptian-Qatari mediation channel, the same track that ran through the officers Israel had just bombed, remains the only viable path for hostage negotiations or ceasefire talks. To whatever extent Jerusalem was still willing to move through diplomatic channels, the road ran through Doha. The international community's response was equally telling. The UN Security Council convened within hours to condemn Israel for violating Qatar's sovereignty, with a notable addition of the United States, which called the strikes counterproductive to regional stability. While not exactly an aggressive move, it nevertheless represents at least a pivot away from the hardline support for Jerusalem's actions Washington has taken over the past several years. But the September strike may have been just the beginning. Israeli officials have already framed the Doha hit as an unfinished job, and policy analysts note the attack redrew the rules by normalizing high-end use of force inside a US partner's capital. Israel's message was clear. We can and will strike Doha again. Qatar's role as Hamas's protector now comes with the risk of Israeli jets over their skyline, a cost-benefit calculation that no amount of American security guarantees can fully offset. This new reality has made Qatar's long-time mediation role increasingly brittle, with each diplomatic intervention now carrying higher political costs and greater operational security hurdles. The pressure is mounting from multiple directions. Netanyahu's government is explicitly demanding that Doha expel or prosecute Hamas leaders, while financial and legal security of Qatar's payment channels, both state aid mechanisms and private donor networks, is tightening. Even if Qatar doesn't face outright sanctions, the political space for banking restrictions and designations has widened considerably since September 9th. Yet despite the strikes, other nations have taken note of Qatar's lucrative position as the world's indispensable mediator. Turkey, for instance, has expanded its own hosting of Hamas figures, though nothing approaching the government-in-exile infrastructure that Doha provides. The Qatari model of leveraging geography and resources to become essential by dealing with unsavory actors may well be spreading. That isn't to say Qatar is alone in this approach, though. Oman, their neighbour to the southeast, essentially played the same role before Doha, just less effectively and less profitably. The style in Muscat has always been quite different, operating much more in the shadows and behind closed doors, rather than hosting formal non-state militants. They ran, for instance, the clandestine US-Iran channel that enabled nuclear negotiations, and they have played a reliable role in hosting Houthi representatives for prisoner swaps. This proliferation reveals something uncomfortable about how the international system actually works. We need countries willing to pay the ransoms we claim never to pay, to host the extremists we refuse to recognize, to conduct the negotiations we can't be seen having. Qatar recognized this gap between public principle and private necessity and built an entire foreign policy around it. Every government that condemned the September strikes while simultaneously depending on Qatari mediation knows exactly what they're doing. Qatar obviously won't face any real consequences for hosting terrorists, that much is clear. What's more interesting is watching other countries realize they can play the same game. When hosting extremist groups becomes a competitive market, with multiple nations bidding for the privilege of being terrorism's preferred middleman, the whole concept of an international pariah starts to break down. Moral flexibility has gone from being a liability to being the most reliable path to relevance. Qatar has made itself so essential to the ugly business of modern diplomacy that even bombing their capital can't break the dependency. In a world that runs on managing crises rather than solving them, they figured out that being everyone's dirty friend beats being anyone's clean enemy. The question now isn't whether Qatar can continue this balancing act, it's whether they can survive it. Thank you for watching.